This is Horror Podcast.
Welcome to This is Horror, a podcast for readers, writers, and creators. I'm Michael David Wilson, and every episode alongside my co-host Bob Pastorella, we chat with the world's best writers about writing, life lessons, creativity, and much more. Today is the second part of our conversation with LP Hernandez. He is the author of a number of books, including his novella, Stargazers, which was part of the My Dark Library series, curated by Sadie Hartman, and his latest story collection, No Gods, Only Chaos, is a brilliant collection that really gets into such a multitude of topics in terms of the horror genre. He really does showcase just such a range of themes and styles, from pitch black humor to really unsettling cosmic horror. So if you needed a starting place for LP, that would be the one that I would personally recommend. But you're going to hear a lot about LP's life and his writing in this conversation, particularly over the course of the two-parter, so this episode and the previous one, 598. But before we get into the conversation, a quick advert break.
In 1867, the young Samantha Gray marries the infamous Captain Jakes, unleashing a series of brutal horrors in this epic splatter western from Death's Head Press. Mayhem Sam by J.D. Grays is a rip-roaring tall tale of revenge, drags a coffin full of gold across the hellscape of Reconstruction, Texas, and explodes at the top of a mountain. You better read this one with the lights on.
House of Bad Memories, the debut novel from Michael David Wilson, comes out on Friday the 13th, this October, via Cemetery Gates Media. Denny just wants to be the world's best dad to his baby daughter, but things get messy when he starts hallucinating his estranged, abusive stepfather, Frank. Then Frank winds up dead, and Denny is held hostage by his junkie half-sister, who demands he uncovers the cause of her father's death. Will Denny defeat his demons, or be perpetually tortured for refusing to answer impossible questions? Clay McLeod Chapman says House of Bad Memories hits so hard you'll spit teeth out once you're done reading it. Pre-order House of Bad Memories by Michael David Wilson in paperback at cemeterygatesmedia.com or in ebook via Amazon.
Okay, with that said, here it is. It is LP Hernandez on This is Horror. So you mentioned From the Red Dirt before, and I think what's so interesting about this one is that originality, because I mean, not only, as you said, have you set it during America's Dust Bowl era, and it is indeed a take on the zombie tale, but it's also kind of a home invasion story. So you've got so many different aspects, and I don't think anybody would have done that with a zombie tale. And, you know, even to the point where some people might not know it's a zombie tale until quite late in the game.
Yeah, I'm confident in my writing, but I guess I can fall back on, at least if I throw enough elements in there that are unique compared to what I assume is being submitted. And then now having my own press, not that we've done a themed call, but you do get kind of a sense of, I don't want to call it competition. I'm not competing with them. I would have called them competition before, but you do get a sense of the quality of the writing that's being submitted to these small presses. So I guess for that one, I did need to check the box with the zombie, but I also wanted to do um, more of an emotional story. And the grandpa could very well have not been a zombie. And I told a very similar story. So that was almost, an afterthought. It does kind of play into the end when it gets a little gross and he shoves his guts down. You can buy it and read it and find out. But the story makes sense without him needing to be a zombie. So I figured, and I guessed right, that would be unique among the submissions for a zombie call.
Yeah, and what kind of reaction did you get from the editor?
He was thrilled. I think there was some tweak to the end. I don't remember what was requested. And at $40, that was the most I had been paid for a story, which, it's not professional rates, but I was getting $10 or a contributor's copy before. So for me, it was like I mentioned about this journey being iterative. Your first acceptance to a non-paying anthology, that's a win because you're competing against people. Then a $10 anthology, that's something. And then for this one, 40, and then professional rates. And that was actually made into a no sleep episode as well. And I've gotten some feedback on that. That was really well received. And I feel like, although Cemetery Joe is when I took the self-imposed shackles off from the red dirt, is when I really trusted my own voice as a writer.
Yeah, and I think that From the Red Dirt might also appeal to fans of the movie Bone Tomahawk. I mean, it obviously Bone Tomahawk was set about 40 or 50 years prior, but there's something in it and the originality of both tales and the kind of combining of subgenres.
Yeah, I think, the setting can do a lot of work for you. So that's its own, like it just raises the stakes because not only are you competing against, like you mentioned, the home invasion aspect and dealing with the resurrected grandfather, there is this ever-present threat to their livelihood that could kind of strike at any moment. So as far as like a writing tool, just changing, like upping the stakes. And if you can do that with the environment, if you can do that with the people that are in the room with your characters, then, that's an easy, kind of tool, I guess, to fall back on. Like, hey, this scene's a bit slow. Let's throw a dust storm in there. Or, if it's character based, then let's have the character look a little bit too long or reach in his pocket, or, just one of those things that add some intrigue, because you can't necessarily maintain that momentum through the entire story, but it's enough to, I guess, at least keep tension in the background of the reader's mind, even if it's not active on the page.
And in terms of planning these things in, I mean, particularly, I suppose, with the longer works, and I know that later we'll talk about In the Valley of the Headless Men, but we're also prone to jump from topic to topic. So if applicable, we can go there now. But in terms of planning things like the dust storm or adding some drama and some tension, is that something that comes into the planning phase? Is that something that is more organic in the writing itself? How do you approach planning before the writing?
For my longer works, I am a very loose planner, in that my typical process would be, and this is what I've done for my last two novellas and for the novel that I've recently completed, is that when that moment of inspiration hits, I try to capture it. I will sit down and write chapter 1, write 2 or 3 sentences, chapter 2, till I get to the end. And it's very possible, and it's inevitable, that you're going to go back and either move some things around or eliminate things entirely as the story evolves and you start to, I hate it when people say, oh, my character made a different choice. Like, no, I made the choice. I'm the writer. I did it. But I can understand how, like, when you start to add some flavor, because right now it's just a name. They're names on a paper. And so you haven't really forced them to interact, and you haven't had the opportunity to make those choices. So once you start making those choices, and these are little pivot points in the story, that it's almost like a choose your own adventure. I could take it this way, the way I've written, or I can take it this way that raises the stakes. So for short fiction, I might just write half a page paragraph. Like if you were going to, try to encapsulate this almost like a summary of the story. So, for a 4,000 word short story, you don't need to break it down to that granular of a detail, but just hit the high points. And then as you're writing it, look for those moments where, if I'm the writer and I'm losing interest, for sure my reader is losing interest. So whatever element it is, if it's the environment, if it's the tension between the characters, if it's kind of doing the unexpected or humor, like with Cemetery Joe, that your reader should not feel, unless it's your intent, your reader should not feel comfortable when they're reading your story.
Yeah, and seeing as you've mentioned humor, and I guess that contrast with the purer horror or more brutality, it's interesting that with The Bystander, which is the third in the collection, I felt that it combined the pure horror of Hesitation Cuts, the second story, with the humor of Cemetery Joe, and even calling a character Gary 2 in itself is hilarious.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I am a very funny person on paper. Like I could, if humor sold at all, I would probably be like a humor writer. But it's another kind of, I guess, a way to distinguish yourself from other writers. I didn't imagine, and I have a little peek behind the scenes, which I've told to other people because I asked Sadie, who ran that call, how many submissions she got. And for the Human Monsters, it was over 1,000 submissions. I think they had 10 invited authors, so that left 25 for the rest of us. So that's under 2.5% acceptance rate. And so you have to imagine it's Human Monsters, going to be a lot of serial killers. So there probably aren't going to be a lot of serial killers who are concerned about their pizza getting cold, or whether or not the people they're killing care about the food that they made them, or would nickname their victims and get to the O's and think Oprah for someone just because they couldn't think of another name. So you take the humor out of the story and it may not be as successful. Then it's kind of, it's like I saw a very interesting review on Terrifier 3 about how it's kind of forcing us to grapple with some things they're in our reality right now. And it balances that, I think, really well with the fact that while you're squirming, like you're almost in on the joke with art, that this isn't real, that all of this is a facade. So giving your reader a little freedom to laugh in the midst of really disgusting things happening, I think it makes you stand out as a storyteller. And then it's also, it just doesn't hit the same beats. It's like, a steady drum, and then you're going up here for the cymbal every now and then just to get a different reaction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the fact that you have some stories that have very little humor and then others which could, broadly be defined as a dark comedy. This is what I was talking about before by saying that it's such a varied collection. I'm wondering, did you release such a varied collection early on to kind of enable people to not shoe you into a subgenre? Because we do see that happen with a number of authors. It's like, right now you're the werewolf guy, or you're the slasher guy, or you're Stephen Graham Jones, which means you're both simultaneously in some bizarre paradox. But is that something that you're conscious of, avoiding being typecast?
I think it's why a lot of themed anthologies struggle. And I've talked to Joe from Cemetery Gates about this. And, it's more like when we discussed it, and I've heard him discuss on other podcasts, I think yours actually, maybe, about, the success of themed anthologies. You're depending on big names, usually as the draw, and that they might stick around for the unknowns, which I've been several times. But I've been in so many that, I can't read 10 takes on whatever it is. It's like, as much as I have a bowl of guacamole, I can't eat it every day. I got to diversify at some point. So I want the reader to have that same experience. And I'm curious as the writer, what's the through line that they're going to find that I'm not aware of? I see some connective tissue between The Bystander and Family Annihilator. I was kind of in a similar headspace when I wrote those, but like, these were from different calls. They kind of represent about 2 to 3 years worth of writing. What's uniting about these that me as the author, I don't understand?
And so, I mean, in terms of the sequencing of the collection, is that a reason why, The Bystander is one that's up front, and then the Family Annihilator is in fact the penultimate story? Are you deliberately giving it that separation?
I felt like there definitely needed to be separation between two. I mean, they're completely different stories, but they could almost be interchangeable characters. So I was almost on the fence about even including Family Annihilator, because I thought, oh, it's another funny serial killer kind of story. But, I felt like I didn't have another story ready at the same quality that I would want to round out the book. So it was kind of either save it for the next one, or I don't know, potentially expose myself to some legitimate criticism of, oh, you did the same story twice. I don't feel like I did necessarily, but I could see how people are like, hey, that kind of reminds me of the other one.
Well, for me, there is always room for one more funny serial killer story. I don't know, though, if that is, something that people widely feel. And if people know my taste in fiction or have read my stories, then it's certainly an acquired taste anyway. But I mean, of course, we've kind of inadvertently skipped hesitation cuts, and this is a nasty little story. This is about obsession. This has a frenetic nightmare quality to it. It also, to my mind, wouldn't be out of place in an Eric LaRocca collection. So, goodness, where did this little fucked up piece of goodness come from?
So I've heard that comparison too. So, but yes, I agree, and others have picked up on that as well. So that was for a call as well, and I initially signed on for the call without a story, and then kind of sitting with the theme for a little bit, I was like, there's some ways this could really go wrong, specifically how it presents mental health. So my intent was not to still get nasty with it, but not to necessarily be disrespectful with someone's journey. So for our main character, it's completely out of his hands. And I hope that's something that the reader will empathize with, that, this wasn't the person he was. This is what his ailment led him to be. And it was actually his wife hanging on just a little bit too long to who she was that resulted in kind of her own end. So it started with the visual. I didn't have necessarily an elderly person in mind. It was the image to me of this couple in bed, and I don't know, maybe like an invasion of the body snatchers. Just someone is certain that the person next to them is not real, but that if they just get through a layer or two, that their real person is somewhere in there. So kind of mixing in some senility and access to razors, and we just kind of took it to the extreme.
Yeah, and you said that you had some concerns initially about tackling the subject matter and dealing sensitively with mental health issues. So I'm wondering, what kind of things did you do to, I guess, mitigate or to address those concerns?
So we have some mental health issues in my family. My uncle's a paranoid schizophrenic. He's been he's been cared for since he's about 18. So I've always been aware of how he's been perceived in the public, especially with the medication that he has to take. He stands out wherever he goes. He's going to attract attention. So I didn't want to play on any of those tropes, any of like like just something very Hollywood, like Split, where I can just shake my head and all of a sudden I'm a different person, or because the theme was institutionalized. And I wanted to make sure that that mental health and an actual affliction, which is out of your control, were two distinct things, and that we didn't have a whole lot of overlap there. So it wasn't, that this person was, a monster and kind of dealing with the echoes of this horrible life that he'd led, or he was in depression, or like that his depression was misunderstood. There was nothing to misunderstand about him. He was a victim as well, who also did something awful, which I think you can do both. You can be a victim of something, and then you can still do something awful.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I mean, we've said before that people are rarely in the kind of binary or the black and white in which people like to easily paint them. There are often good and bad qualities about everyone. I wonder, in terms of things with your uncle, I mean, how do you navigate that as a family to do your best for him?
He's getting the best care that he can now. I think it's, with my mom being his sister, it's just coming to accept that his life will only be of a certain quality. Never going to have a family, never going to have a career. And now he's in his 60s, so all that's kind of behind him. Those possibilities are well behind him now. But then beyond that, I think as you age, you start to ask the bigger questions. And what was the purpose of this life to begin with? Because, like for a lot of diseases that don't present right away, you get 18 years of a relatively normal life. Not to say it was peaceful all the time, like almost as a tease for what the rest of your life ends up being, where in order to function, you have to be so heavily medicated that you're basically in a haze with these brief moments of lucidity. So it's painful. I think like I said, for my mom, as she's gotten older, for myself, it just kind of makes you a little self-reflective, and then ask those bigger questions of the universe, which is what I tend to do with my writing, is what is the purpose of this life? And then for him specifically, what is the purpose of that life?
Yeah, and I mean, talking about purpose and these wider questions, that does bring us to the title of the collection, No Gods, Only Chaos, which then comes from the story Offerings to an Old God. So, I mean, was that another one that was for a themed anthology? And I mean, with that being so, what was the process for that one?
So that was for Monster Layers, which was also Dark Matter, who did Human Monsters. I think they did 3 that had Monster in the title. And just to, for any writers that are listening, I paid a lot of attention to what the editor was looking for. So when it was announced, she kind of had her wish list, or, what she enjoys. And I didn't do like a, check the box. Oh, I included that. I included that. But I went into the story with kind of a general sense of some elements I wanted to include because I was very cognizant of the person who was going to be reading it. So for that one, I guess the way I try to stand out with that, I did try to add a little twist at the end, but also I think I prepared people for a certain kind of story, and then at that point, my goal was to make the reveal something that was completely unexpected.
Oh yeah, and you certainly achieved that. And I think if the previous story we were talking about had a La Rocca vibe, then this one, and Bob will probably anticipate this, almost had a Todd Kiesling vibe. He's always bloody sacrificing and offering things to old gods. Hopefully just in his fiction, but never know with Todd.
No, I wouldn't trust him. I wouldn't trust him with a pen, that's for sure.
Yeah, there you go. You heard it here. And I mean, goodness, though, when you were saying before about, reflecting on, so what you said with your uncle, and then as a kind of wider commentary, looking at what is the purpose of one's life. How do you begin to answer that in terms of the purpose for your own life? And then how does that kind of affect actions that you might take going forward?
Sometimes I'm just putting the question out there and seeing what comes back to me. Because I don't think I'm alone. I just don't think that everybody wraps these questions in fiction. So part of it is like either conditioning or preparing myself for the worst. And that would be something like The Bystander, where I've already put myself in this headspace. So on the off chance I ever find myself in that environment, I've kind of thought through it. And I know, the worst it could be, I've already written down. And also, I'm going to check the spaghetti for glass first. And then as we get a little more kind of, cosmic, a little esoteric and existential, that's kind of, to me, that touches like an ultimate fear. So I feel like I'm almost spoilery, but the idea of living forever, but trapped. So that's part of what the monster in the end, when it reveals itself, reveals how it consumes and what it does with the things that are offered to it, and that they don't die. So you don't get the chance to come back as a butterfly. You get to exist with this thing that spends the vast majority of its life hibernating. And so you're just stuck. So I guess I've already thought of two pretty awful possibilities. Most of what I'm doing is putting the worst direction my life could possibly go on paper and hoping that it doesn't happen to me.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people say prepare for the worst, hope for the best. But in terms of preparing for that worst, there is no preparation. It's just you will experience the worst, and that's it. You can't prepare for it.
Yeah, the best I can do is write stories.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, talking about writing stories, The Last of Our Kind, you said in the story notes that there was a novella's worth of a story to tell. And I know from talking off air that you have some plans in terms of how you're going to tell it. So please tell our listeners.
So some of the feedback for No Gods has been largely positive, but a couple of the reviews I have read or that were shared directly with me said, when they get down to like each story, they would say this felt unfinished or it felt rushed. And I agree, even though it's like 5,000 words long, which is long for a short story, it still it's not enough to kind of capture a summer of four girls dealing with one of their friends being made into a vampire. So I did have a novella's length or worth of story to tell at the time I wrote that, and that wasn't enough as well. So as of now, same title, same characters, but the journey is definitely expanded upon, and the ending is completely different because we flash forward in time. I did write The Last of Our Kind as a novel, so it's at first draft stage. Early beta readers are positive, so I'm hopeful that I won't resort to having to publish this under my own company, and that someone else will want to pay me for it.
Well, I was going to ask you about the process for this one in particular, going from short story to novella to novel, but what you just said about, you hope that you'll be able to get somebody else to publish it. Now that you have your own publishing house, I would imagine in terms of what you look for in a publisher has risen. You've upped the ante because you don't really want to land it with a publisher where you could do the same thing. It just doesn't make any sense. So, what is it that you're looking for now in terms of when you're deciding, do I independently put this out or do I go with another press?
So for this, I guess for all, but specifically for The Last of Our Kind, I grew up reading Boy's Life, and Boy's Life is one of my treasured. I've met Robert McCammon. That's a highlight of, my life, I would say. It's one of the few books I've read more than 3 times. I have multiple versions of it. And I probably read that a couple times. I don't want to get the McCammon and King folks fighting in the comments. But I definitely have a preference between the two. And, there's some recent stuff out like Paper Girls, which is more focused, shining the light on girls. And a diverse cast as well. But I don't to me, I haven't seen anything that's captured that era, which is that pivot from analog to digital. Like that mid 90s feels like such a kind of a jumping off point. So I really had the goal of making a book feel like it was rooted in the 90s, from the songs to the pop culture references to the language that they used. And so I want a publisher that's going to be as excited about investing in a story about 4 brown girls that riding bikes. Again, I did something different. I set it in the desert. I know there's some desert vampire stories out there, but that's not the traditional setting. And yeah, that's going to be, I guess, see the larger possibility there of an audience of people who have never been represented in this genre finding their way to it. So if a publisher's on because, we like the story, or, we could make some cool cover art out of this, it's a little less enticing than, I can't wait to get this in the hands of a 12-year-old girl in San Antonio or El Paso who's going to see herself in a book, and she's never, ever seen herself in a book before.
Yeah, makes total sense. And I mean, in terms of who you're submitting it to or how you're going about that, I mean, what is that particular part of the process looking like?
So this is the first original completed work I've been able to hand my agent. So she's on her first pass through, and we may come out the other side with recommendations. As far as the people who have read it, only one of them is not related to me by blood. So I'm trying to take all the praise from those I do share blood with a grain of salt. But they do say there's still more story to tell. And I agree. There's a lot in the middle. Like what I love about Boy's Life and what I loved about it is when you just get lost in that middle 60%. I could care less about the spider at the end. but it's the kind of the whimsy of like Boy's Life, Old Moses, and the preacher talking about what is it? The devil is my strawberry. He's mishearing lyrics from a Beatles song or something like that. All that fun and games. If we're going by Save the Cat rules, the fun and games part, I could definitely beef that up a little bit, and I would love to. Just waiting on her response if it's necessary, because of the fallout. Getting dropped from Cemetery Dance, I do have a couple of avenues that are open to me once it's ready to go to that level, like once it's polished enough.
So then, returning from it being a short story and then a novella and then a novel, did you actually write a completed novella and then you revised that to novel, or was it more in the from the short story to novella planning stage you realized actually I'm planning a novel here?
It was about 2 chapters in. I think my first chapter ended up being close to 4,000 words, which was just 1,000 words shy of the completed short story that's in No Gods Only Chaos. And I was like, if we have 16 or 17 more of these, we're well out of novella range. And then it wasn't my initial plan to bring this into the future, but it became necessary at a point because the way the story evolved, how it ended would have been very unsatisfying for the reader. So they needed it to come forward into the future. And that chapter alone is a relatively long chapter. That one's about 6,000 words as well, where we kind of flash forward with some characters. So once those ideas kind of cemented, I understood we were well out of novella range.
I love that you're more it sounds like you're more interested in the journey of the characters than the actual resolution. And I mean, and I don't mean to make it sound like it doesn't matter how it ends or how it begins or anything like that. But I feel that if you can invest in a character's journey, then you can bring it on home when you hit the ending. You land the ending better. When I'm not invested in a character, I don't care how it ends. It can end flat. But if I'm invested in a character and you still don't stick the ending, I'm still probably going to love your fucking book. I mean, it's because I've become invested in this character journey, and that's why I read.
I think that's the biggest lesson I've learned as a writer is that character comes almost before story. I know we're going to talk about In the Valley of the Headless Men, but just to let y'all know, if you didn't do your research and find this out, this is like the 4th version of this story. And there are versions of this story that exist and are published where the characters are completely different. And I find those stories unsuccessful, those versions of that story, because I didn't care what happened to those characters. So why would a reader who doesn't have my insight, why would they care about it? So that I would say, and it's only been in the past 3 or 4 years that I've really understood that. What stands out, like you mentioned, as a Lord of the Rings fan, it's everything in the middle, like that whole journey. I don't care if Tolkien spends 2 pages describing dew on a leaf. Like I'm still entranced and still so invested in these characters that, the ending with the Shire being on fire, it's not my favorite ending. And it's kind of like the 3rd ending of the book. But like you said, Bob, everything else leading up to that, that's why I stick around.
Well, as you've brought it up again and we've hinted at it many times, let's just jump into In the Valley of the Headless Men.
Let's do it.
What was the origin story for this one? And then how did it come to be in its final published form?
I mean, origin story is my brother and I have 2 different dads, and different strained relationships with both for different reasons. But then I am someone who, in addition to supernatural, I'm interested in unusual. So out of place artifacts. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to either one of you. So this is like, oh, I found a Roman coin 50 feet down, like in the soil, in Minnesota. Like, how did that get there?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time like reading about, and I have multiple books about it, just like that. It's kind of become a bit of a more accepted in culture now. With, I'm forgetting his name. I have a couple. Graham Hancock, with some of his programs on Netflix. So I've always been interested in those like forbidden mysteries, hidden history, stuff like that. And so at some point, I found my way to the Nahanni Valley, which is a real place, and it has this real history behind it of, on the non-supernatural side, like the very much terrestrial and human side, that there were several instances through the 1900s of explorers, trappers, people hoping to find gold, going to this extremely remote, like if you haven't looked at it on a map, it is up there. It is far away from anything. Going to this extremely remote place and not coming back. Months, whatever, later, they are found with their heads missing. The torso, the body's there, but the head is gone. And understanding, yes, there are predators up there, but what predator would behead a human and leave the good meat? Like, I would assume it's something that would want the head as a prize. And so there's this, the native culture, or the native people who previously inhabited the region, they're called the Dene, have stories in their history about giants. And they said they were chased away by giants. And you throw in like, oh, there's out of place vegetation. There's things that grow here that shouldn't, to legends of this is the entrance to the inner earth, to there are still rogue mammoth herds, like all of that. It's just like I love it because it feels like so much of the world is accounted for, to have this one place where there's still the possibility of magic, of the unknown to exist. It felt like the biggest playground for a writer. That there is another book by the exact same title, but it's not a horror book. For a horror writer, it's like, why hasn't anybody done this before? So I took the environment. There's been several iterations of this story. Once I made it about myself and my brother, that's kind of what I think made it meaningful for me as the writer.
So where are the other iterations of the story? Are they available? Can people still read them?
Mm-hmm. There's a version on the pay side of No Sleep. That one came out of about a 8,000 word short story that is also in my collection called The Rat King, which is a fully illustrated collection. A lot of my No Sleep stories are in there. But in that iteration, they're college kids on a reverse spring break. So instead of going somewhere tropical, they're going somewhere, the exact opposite. So I wrote that with no research whatsoever. This place sounds really cool. I'm going to put a bunch of college kids in there and do awful stuff to them. And I realized, I think hearing it in audio, it pointed out every flaw to me. So the idea has stuck with me. I felt like, and Bob, like you were talking about sticking the landing, I felt like this is one where, as a plane, I never stuck the landing on it. There is a 60,000 word version of the story that, and Bob, you also mentioned Pit Dark, that I got a bite on Pit Dark and I sent to an agent and they never responded to me. So I guess it's home, and its rightful length is novella, and it's with this story that I've written.
Yeah, it's a very cosmic story, and it's a lot of people, or some people out there, when you hear cosmic, they immediately think space, and Earth is a planet in the middle of outer space, and so there is cosmic in the Earth. It's here if you really want to find it, or if you don't want to find it, it will find you. And so there's some writers that obviously Laird Barron comes to mind. Michael Griffin comes to mind. This is definitely something that made me also feel Scott Nicolay. It's very outer dark type story, and I had never heard of this place, never. And to find out it's real, like I'm like, whoa, wait a second. I can actually go here. I don't want to. I've seen the Blair Witch Project. I'm not good with camping, but I can actually go here. There's a history behind it. I'm like, man, this is so incredible, so incredible, very, very cosmic. I was blown away by it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that the greatest appeal to that is it is accessible. It's a tough journey to get there, but this stuff isn't from, this is from the last century when all of us here were born in the 1900s. This isn't in the distant past. Like, I think these beheadings stopped like in the 60s or 70s. So,
have you visited the Nahanni National Park?
I've been to British Columbia. That's the closest I've been. And that was for a baby moon with my wife. So even that, probably within 3,000 miles of it. It's not like the tourist season, which is what I learned when I properly researched this for this book. It's a very narrow window for the tourist season. So I think it's I actually got in touch with a person up there who does river tours. And so she helped answer several of my questions, Dana. And originally, like I said, the first iteration, this was spring break. She's like, no one would be here in spring break. Like June is the earliest someone would come here because of how cold the snow melt. It is, it is basically in the Arctic Circle. But it does have some hot springs that do keep some areas more temperate than you would expect for a place that's that far north. And that helps to feed into some of the lore. Like you would potentially see a plant there that looks like it would be at home in Florida, like a fern that looks more tropical than it does, Arctic. So haven't been there. Don't know actually at this point if I would go, but yeah, I think British Columbia, beautiful. I'm perfectly fine staying there.
Yeah, it's a difficult one where I can see the appeal, particularly as the author of In the Valley of the Headless Men, but I can also see exactly why you're like, I'm not chancing anything.
I could just see the headline.
Yeah.
Writer in the Valley of the Headless Men loses head in the valley.
Yeah. Yeah. He becomes Headless Man. Oh dear. Yeah. We don't want that to happen. Don't lose your head.
No, I just won't go.
Yeah. Oh, that is a good strategy. And in terms of when you were getting that help from Dana and you were asking her various questions, did she also provide like location photographs or kind of give very specifics in terms of that? Or were you kind of looking on Google Maps as well and like, well, I wonder if I walk that trail, what would happen?
I did. I did look on Google Maps, and she basically answered every question I had. And that was the stuff that I had been guessing at prior. So, like I mentioned in the previous iterations, that was based off of what I read about these legends, but it wasn't kind of rooted in the experience of someone who travels there or works there. So as far as the seasons go, she helped me figure that out. Some other research I did independently about like when the sun would come up versus, because it's so far north, it's not like that full day of like 24 hours of sunlight. It's not quite that far. But she talked about, I think something I had gotten wrong is you just guess a place that far removed from people that the water's going to be crystal clear and drinkable. And, so that was a previous story element. And that was an observation that she had, was that with all the snow melt, with as much churn through the river systems, that it's actually going to be very cloudy. So it's not going to be this, very distinct blue like you would imagine, kind of an alpine setting would be. It'd be very fast moving water, very cloudy. So there were a lot of kind of gaps that she filled in, but we didn't go into kind of any of the weirdness of it. It was more like the actual environment as she's experienced it.
And so, in terms of when you reached out to her, was that via email? Did you, email?
Yep,
Was she receptive straight away?
Yeah, I mean, I think she was surprised I was writing a horror story, which is how I framed it. But I mean, of course, working there, they know it has another name to it, other than Nahani. So, but she was very enthusiastic to answer. She said that she does get contacted by not fiction writers, but like researchers regularly. So it wasn't out of the norm for her to be contacted for information, but out of the norm for her to be contacted for information pertaining to a cosmic horror survival novella.
And so now that you've tackled this one, are there any other real life locations that you want to, tackle in one of your horror stories?
So I feel like I kind of did with The Last of Our Kind, in that there is something about West Texas that I feel, I don't say called to, but I don't know a better term for it. I was fortunate to write a season finale of the No Sleep podcast, and that was partially set in and around Marfa, Texas, which has its own legends about these strange lights. I'm sure Bob, being in Texas, probably heard of the Marfa lights. So I took a trip out there, actually, while my mom was visiting, and we went to the Marfa Lights viewing area. We spent time in the town. And subsequently, I've been back to the Big Bend National Park area, which is a huge national park in the Chihuahua Desert. And I don't know, there's something so, like, you can drive for 40 minutes without seeing another person. So there is something very stark, isolating, and once again, coming back to the theme of different, which is why I chose that kind of region as the setting for my vampire story, because obviously a vampire wouldn't live in a sunny place, so that's exactly where I put him.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the originality, and subverting expectations has become part of your MO. And, why not? Because if you're writing the same story that has already been written, well, is there a point?
As long as I don't start setting things in space, like every movie series that gets past like the 5th iteration and ends up going to space, I think I'll keep doing it.
Yeah, I'm not so interested in in those stories, but that can be for the This Is Space podcast, which anyone else can start but me. Well, we are coming up to the time that we have together today, so I wanted to ask a few questions that I often do to first-time interviewees. And so, to begin with, I wonder, what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self?
Join the Air Force, because I'd be retired by now. Don't wait an extra 5 years. You're going to do it anyway. Just get it out of the way.
Does that mean you've got 5 years until retirement?
I've got a year and a half. So if I had joined at 18, I could have been retired by 38. I joined at 23, so I'll be retired at 43.
Okay. So then, when you retire, will you, from the Air Force, will you be looking at taking on another day job? Will you be hoping that writing has done its magic and you are now a full-time writer plus retirement check? What are the plans for the future there?
I guess the hope and the dream would be the latter, that I can be successful enough at this, that, and with Sobilo books, that maybe at some point we'll start making money off of it. Right now we're not. We're losing a lot, but that's okay. We got to get started. So, yeah, I mean, realistically, my income will be cut in half. So I'm going to have to account for that somehow. What I haven't ever had is the freedom and the time to write. So Stargazers, my first novella, which we didn't talk about that, but I wrote that on my lunch breaks as well at work. So for an hour a day, I would chip away at that story. I've never had really, unobstructed 7 or 8 hours to just sit down and write. Not to say I had the stamina for that, but if I can be as produce the work that I have really less than part-time, maybe it's possible I could do it full-time and be successful at it.
I think you've got a really big chance of making that a reality, and hopefully to coincide with the retirement from the current Air Force job. But I mean, there's so many things that you've got going on, some that we've mentioned on the podcast, some that we haven't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've got just such a good chance of that. And keep doing what you're doing, keep working hard, which I can't imagine you would never not work hard. And I think the dream will become a reality.
I'm excited for it. Just wait.
Yeah. Well, what is the best and what is the worst writing advice that you have ever been given?
So I don't know if this is the best, but a lot of the writing advice kind of flowed off me. I read several of the books. Of course, everyone's read on writing. But I was in Richard Thomas, the author, has had, I don't think still does, but he did writing through, I think it's Lit Reactor, which I don't think is a thing anymore. I think it's gone under. But he held a competition where you sent him a short story and he picked the best one. He would give access to all of the short story writing mechanics materials, which would normally be a paid for course. And he picked my story, which is actually in the Rat King, my 2 collections ago, called Comancheria. And he gave me access to all this material. The very beginning of it is actually about beginnings. It's about the opening line. And subsequent to that, the opening paragraph, and then the opening page. But really starting with the opening line and now being on the receiving end of a lot of material to read for So Below books. I understand how important that is. I put myself in the shoes of someone in a bookstore or library picking up books. Of course, they have to be attracted to the cover. There has to be something appealing about the cover or interesting about it. That's step one. But they're going to read that first line and that first paragraph. And if that first line, first paragraph is a dream sequence, or if it's world building because you feel as a writer, you have to shove all this, but for the rest of it to make sense, they have to be prepared for it. So you got to give them all this exposition first. It's not terribly interesting. And if I'm in competition with so many other authors who knock it out of the park with that first line and that first paragraph, then that's a losing battle. And I don't think you sacrifice any of your art to put your best work on the first page. Not to say that you're going to put bad work later, but really concentrate on that first page, because it's like shopping for a car. Like if you're walking around a lot, kicking tires or whatever you're doing, there has to be something compelling about it to get you invested, to get you to turn the page, to get you to say, I gotta finish this. I can't finish in the store. I got to take it home. Or even in the digital age, if you're reading an Amazon Kindle preview, you've got several pages. You got to hook your reader. You don't have to sacrifice artistry to still write a compelling story where you're not saving your best for the middle. Oh, and worst. Okay. That was the best. Worst. Just that I know there are opinions on things like adverbs. And I would say if it's done well or it makes sense, that there really are no rules to writing. And I think it is Stephen King in On Writing who talks about adverbs and how to make something active versus adding an ly to it. I think that in general is good practice, but sometimes the best word you have to reach for is an adverb. And to do something outside of that because you're adhering to a rule is inauthentic. So as far as rules go, I would say there are no rules, but they're definitely a reader's going to know what they like and what they don't like. And that's really why, I guess, going back to that original good advice, you really have to knock it out on the first page. And I guess be truthful to the rest of the journey that the reader's going to take with your book.
Yeah, I think these are excellent words of wisdom for the writers listening, and an excellent place really for us to finish this conversation with such, valuable advice. So thank you so much for joining us, and please let our listeners know where can they connect with you.
I have a Twitter still active because I'm hoping Elon Musk goes to prison and that gets returned to, I don't know, the government. I don't know who's going to take it over, but I'm just holding the space of my name. But I have mostly migrated over to Blue Sky. So you can find me there just under my name, and sobelowbooks.com. That's where we're announcing all of our upcoming releases. So I'm around the socials. I have a TikTok. I kind of put stuff out there every now and then. So most places I'm going to be LP Hernandez or author LP Hernandez.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our listeners with?
Be a good person, read indie horror, and support This Is Horror.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for the second and final part of the conversation with LP Hernandez on This Is Horror. Join us again next time when we will be chatting to Chuck Palahniuk for episode 600 of This Is Horror podcast. And it is a very special episode because we dive deep into the seminal, into the infamous Guts, the short story that caused a lot of controversy. And we are discussing and analyzing it as we simultaneously celebrate 600 episodes of This Is Horror podcast. If you want to listen to that ahead of the crowd, and if you want to watch the video version of that ahead of the crowd, both are up now on patreon.com/This Is Horror. They are a great way to support the podcast, to keep it going, to keep it alive. So have a little look, and if it's a good fit for you, I would love for you to join us. Okay, before I wrap up, a quick advert break.
House of Bad Memories, the debut novel from Michael David Wilson, comes out on Friday the 13th, this October, via Cemetery Gates Media. Denny just wants to be the world's best dad to his baby daughter, but things get messy when he starts hallucinating his estranged, abusive stepfather, Frank. Then Frank winds up dead, and Denny is held hostage by his junkie half-sister, who demands he uncovers the cause of her father's death. Will Denny defeat his demons, or be perpetually tortured for refusing to answer impossible questions? Clay McLeod Chapman says House of Bad Memories hits so hard you'll spit teeth out once you're done reading it. Pre-order House of Bad Memories by Michael David Wilson in paperback at cemeterygatesmedia.com or in ebook via Amazon.
In 1867, the young Samantha Gray marries the infamous Captain Jakes. unleashing a series of brutal horrors in this epic splatter western from Death's Head Press. Mayhem Sam by J.D. Grace is a rip-roaring tall tale of revenge, drags a coffin full of gold across the hellscape of Reconstruction, Texas, and explodes at the top of a mountain. You better read this one with the lights on.
Now, I mentioned the This Is Horror Patreon, but as of last week, I have set up the Michael David Wilson Patreon, which is at patreon.com/Michael David Wilson. And I would love you all to join that. And this is not a sales pitch, because whilst there are paid membership perks, there are also a number of perks for free members. So you can join it whether you pay or not. Now, some of the premium perks include unplugged garage recordings every week where I narrate my books chapter by chapter. You'll also get an unedited video of each of those recordings. At the time of recording, I have put up chapter 1 of House of Bad Memories, and I've also put up the short story Tekka Tekka Tekka. Now, I also give you some on-the-go audio and video check-ins live from Japan, and you can submit questions to me at any time. And whether you are a free or a paid patron, I will answer your question. I will make sure that it is not behind a paywall, so if you're pledging at $3, then you will definitely see that. If you're pledging at $5, you will see that. If you're a free patron, then you will see that too. I'll make sure that the person whose question has been submitted is behind the appropriate paywall. Now, you'll also be the first to hear Michael David Fiction news and announcements. I wanted to have something separate from This Is Horror just to really be able to discuss my writing, because all of my social media platforms, they are This Is Horror and Michael David Wilson combined. This is the only place right now that is specific to the MDW fiction and the books that I am putting out. So patreon.com/Michael David Wilson. And if you like the sound of that, I will be delighted to have you on board. As always, I would like to end with a quote. And this is from David Lynch, somebody who is missed so very much by the entire horror community, the entire film community, the entire world. We all miss him so much, and he inspired us. He continues to inspire us, and this is from his amazing book, Catching the Big Fish, Meditation, Consciousness and Creativity. It's a book that I own. It's a book that I think will spark joy and will spark creativity for all of you. So here is that quote. Ideas are like fish. If you want to catch little fish, you can stay in the shallow water. But if you want to catch the big fish, you've got to go deeper. Down deep, the fish are more powerful and more pure. They're huge and abstract, and they're very beautiful. I'll see you in the next episode for episode 600 with Chuck Palahniuk. But until then, take care of yourself, be good to one another, read horror, keep on writing, and have a great, great day.
This is Horror Podcast.